So a shifting format is that I'm posting these on YouTube, and YouTube videos you want horizontal. So your phones are going to need to be tilted if you're looking at this through your phone. But it does allow me to get in alongside the screen and not block much of it, so that's a good thing. We are moving on to chapter 2, and I'm going to try to remember at the beginning of every chapter to repost my contact information if you want to call me in the lab. Most of you are probably seeing me every week in the lab anyway, and you can ask me questions then. But if something comes up in between, you can call. You can always email me. I'm accessible. Even though I look old and grumpy, I tend to not be that old and grumpy when people ask me questions. So we are moving into the next chapter, chapter 2. And the next 2 chapters are connected to you can't forget that science, like so many things, is a product of human beings. Human beings who still like the ice cream truck when it comes by. I don't know why if I stand in one place or another, it blots out the screen, but I'm watching the screen, so I'm trying to keep that from happening. Anyway, this chapter has to do with our need to try to explain what's going on, which has always been limited by what we do actually understand about the world. And then the next chapter has to do with our need to label and categorize the world. You know, put names on things. We're language-using animals. We need to, and then try to figure out how stuff's connected. Because we're also social animals, and understanding how people are connected to each other and connected to you has always been a very important part of our understanding of the world. But this chapter is on science, the see stuff, explain stuff approach to the world. Typically, we start with a story that we connect to an Italian fellow. I already have this written down, if I can figure out which way to go. I was part way into this and the phone rang, so I'd already written this down. Francesco Redi, or Redi, he was Italian. His experiment is considered to be kind of an example of early experimentation. You can go back to the ancient Greeks for this. This is more from the Renaissance. But it addressed kind of a widely accepted idea about how the world works. And so it makes it somewhat important. Spontaneous generation. What does that mean? A lot about the world during Redi's time was stuff that human beings couldn't observe because they didn't have the senses for it. And they'd look around and see things kind of appear that it's like, okay, it's been winter, the streams, there haven't really been anything going on in the streams, and then it's spring and there's all these living things in the streams. Where'd they come from? And people go, well, you know, the snails crawling around, it used to be some of those rocks. You know, if the conditions are right, a rock over the course of the winter, as the spring warms up, it turns into a snail. And those fallen leaves generate become fish. You know, they're flat like fish. Dead leaves, never alive rocks, becoming something alive is the basic idea of spontaneous generation. Redi addressed another example of this where if you left your meat out long enough, you'd come back to your meat and there would be little hollows in the meat, and in the hollows would be little maggots, you know, little crawly little white wormy things. Now we know, because we can see at a smaller scale than they could, that maggots start as fly eggs. Fly eggs are microscopic. They're too small to easily be seen. And what happens is the eggs hatch, the little larvae, the maggots come out, and they start chowing down on the surface of the meat. And as they chow down, they make themselves a little hollow that they're in. Whereas to somebody else, it may look like the meat is turned into the maggots. Where is the meat that was there? Well, there's maggots there. So the maggots have spontaneously generated from the dead meat. Redi suspected something was going on with the flies. And he also didn't like he didn't like the idea of life from unlife. Right? We did the whole first chapter on life. That isn't the way that it's supposed to work, unless you're trying to explain where the very first life came from. And so he said, okay, I'm going to demonstrate to people with an experiment that this doesn't actually work the way they think it does. So he goes, I'm going to set up an experiment. I'm going to put meat in two containers. Test container and a comparison container. The comparison container is what we would call the control. And how you label them kind of depends on how you see the test. A lot of people would say he'd have an open container and a closed container. And because he was thinking flies in the back, and just getting the flies to get away from the meat. Now we might look at the open container as the test and the closed container as the control. You could think of the closed container as the test, excluding the flies, and the open container as the control. But the idea that he set up a test with a comparison. Happened here, didn't happen here, must be connected to the difference between the tests, closed, open. He let it run. Maggots turned up in the open container. Maggots didn't turn up in the closed container. He went, look, meat does not just magically turn into maggots. There's something else going on here. And as often happens in science, when you put your interpretation of your results out into the world, people come at you and go, we got a problem with how you set this up. Spontaneous generation, just like we and other living things, needs air. You seal that container up, there's no air getting in there. Of course the meat's not going to turn into maggots with no air. You didn't tell us this doesn't work. You just showed us that air is necessary for it to happen. We were pretty sure we knew that. So we know, as scientists often do, okay, I got to redesign my experiment to address this issue, this confounding factor that they've brought back to me when they've looked over my results. So it's like, okay, I'm going to run it again. I'm not going to put a lid on the container. I'm going to put cheesecloth. Put cheesecloth that you could see you can blow through it, so air can go through the cheesecloth. You could breathe through cheesecloth. But I'm going to put cheesecloth over one container and leave the other one open. And sure enough, the cheesecloth covered container didn't generate maggots, but the open one did. He was lucky flies don't just drop their eggs, because they might have gone through the cheesecloth, but that didn't happen. And so it was the first of kind of a first step to eventually figuring out what was going on with flies and meat. And as you have a link in your book, it took a long time to kind of knock this idea out. And it reappeared when people started to discover that diseases were associated with these tiny microscopic particles, these germs that could germinate diseases. They originally thought that these tiny little cells you find in sick people happen when our cells, as our cells died, they became germs. It was a different type of spontaneous generation. It took a while to, because the idea that they could get from one person to another and make the next person sick, that was a tricky thing to grasp. But eventually, even that spontaneous generation went away as an idea. So a system was developed. And we're going to look at the system two ways. We're going to talk about the basic rules of the system. That's the next thing I'm doing here. And then we're going to come back and talk about the nuts and bolts. How does the system work in its best way? It's like anything that people do. You try to do it right, and then the world comes in and mucks around with your ability to do it right. But the system, that's W/, that's a with. People come up with explanations. They see something happen and they go, oh, I think I know what's happening here. But to science people, they listen to your idea and they go, wow, that's really cool. That's really interesting. How do you test that? Because we want to see if it really works that way. We need to be able to come up with a test. So an idea that's just a really, really neat test is a really, really neat idea. But if you can't really test it it's going to be hard for us to be completely convinced that it's a good explanation for whatever you're explaining. And sometimes the tests work in weird ways. And a lot of times in physics, it's like, look, I can get the math to work. And the math is, a lot of times their version of a test. That happened with Einstein's theories, where his test was only doable theoretically for 15 or 16 years, I think. The idea that a large mass might warp the space around it, his idea of how gravity works. But a lot of people were already convinced by the math by then. Biologists, we like to actually get in, get our hands dirty and test things. As an undergrad, I took a whole course in logic. It's very mathematical. If you've ever done geometry and done proofs, it looks a lot like that. And there is an acceptable logic structure. And the system is supposed to work using freely accepted logical structure. It basically amounts to, this should make sense to everybody because it's logical. Of course, the problem is when you kind of step off the edge into new ideas, not everybody's logic matches everybody else's logic. So it's a great baseline, but this one is really, because people will argue about the implications of things, and they'll insist that the other idea isn't logical. And yes, it is, your idea isn't logical. So, it's people. But ideally, it's supposed to be using kind of broadly accepted logic rules. A well-trained science person hates this word. Oh, we proved this. Well, no, you didn't. You ran your tests, you've accumulated a whole bunch of evidence, but maybe there's a better explanation than the one you're working off of. Maybe we'll eventually find that your answer is either wrong or incomplete in a very, very serious way. And don't tell me that you proved it until all the other possibilities have popped up in other people's heads over the next 100 years, and even then, who knows? I mean, when Einstein came along with his theory of gravity, Isaac Newton's idea of gravity as an attractive force between two masses had been widely accepted. The math really worked. He had done lots of tests to show how it works and to model it into how that's supposed to be a solar system, how the solar system works. And then Einstein came along and went, I love your math, I love your applications of all this, but your basic underlying assumption of what gravity is wrong. I think this is what it is. And so he has his ideas out there. And if there's a possibility, as we look farther and farther and farther out into the cosmos, the universe is doing weird stuff that doesn't really fit Einstein's rules. Dark matter, dark energy, is a way to squeeze Einstein's rules so that they fit what's really going on, because nobody's really come up with an accepted new idea, a new explanation for maybe gravity doesn't work the same under cosmological distances. But a couple of people have suggested it, but they haven't been able to convince anybody else. They haven't done the math, right? But you don't prove. Now, weirdly enough, we'll kind of let you disprove stuff. But even that's iffy, because the idea could be right, your test might not get you what it's supposed to get you. That doesn't necessarily prove that your idea is wrong. But there is embedded in science what they call falsifiability. And what's technically called the Null Hypothesis. And the Null Hypothesis amounts to, is that, this wonderful idea that you got, I don't think it's right. I think it's wrong. And so your hypothesis is always reflected in the Null Hypothesis. You have an idea, the Null Hypothesis says, no, you're wrong. And if your evidence doesn't support your hypothesis, it supports the null hypothesis. Now, here's the weird thing. Science involves imagination and design. We'll talk about this as we go through the chapter. Some people design their tests to test this rather than their hypothesis. They come up with, well, what if my idea is wrong? How can I test to make, to see that it's wrong? To me, it's kind of a backwards way of looking at it, but everybody's brain works differently. So to some people, that makes perfect logical sense to design around the null hypothesis rather than your actual working hypothesis. Here's the thing about science that tends to drive non-science people crazy. It's always possible somebody's going to come along and go, nope, I see your evidence, but I think this is what is actually going on there. I think here's a better explanation for the evidence. I notice you've got a couple of problems where your evidence doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do. Here's my explanation, and it covers that better. That's what happened with Einstein and gravity. Is there were a few chinks in the armor of Newton's real-world observations of gravity, and Einstein went, this is what's going on. And so far, it's held up pretty well, but it isn't necessarily proven. But the idea that, here's a study that tells you this, this is bad for you, and then like 3 years later, I guess it's really not that bad for you. In medical stuff, in nutritional stuff, that happens all the time. And sometimes it really is, we thought it was bad for you, now we're not so sure it's bad for you. We thought it was good for you, now we're pretty sure it's bad for you under these conditions. And sometimes it's a matter of, well, you think these two studies contradict each other, except they were looking at one aspect and we're looking at another aspect, and they seem to be contradictory, and we need to kind of figure that out. As a few years ago, there was a study on putting people who'd had heart attacks on low sodium diets. They did 2 different studies. And when you design a study, one of the questions you have to come up with is, what are we going to measure to see if our ideas have any merit? And one group decided to measure recurrent heart attacks. You put them on low sodium diets. You've got a control group that's not on a low sodium diet. And you see how many repeat heart attacks happen in each group. And their results showed that there was a significant reduction in heart attacks in the low sodium people versus the people who just went about their lives and kept eating salt. Somebody else did a study. They said, we're not going to look at heart attacks, we're going to look at overall mortality, death. Still the same comparison groups. Well, it turned out that there wasn't any significant difference in those groups. That the low sodium people died at the same rate as the doing their regular meals died. One would assume they just didn't die of heart attacks as often. And that often happens in science, where you look at these and you go, what the heck is going on here? What else is, what's making the heart attacks drop but the death rate be the same? And that's how science also works, where your results wind up being the question the next person has to answer. So, on the list, oops, if I could spell. Always subject to changes. Somebody can come in and completely overturn your apple cart. Einstein's idea about gravity is completely not Newton's idea of gravity. It's a warping of space-time is really different than an attraction between two masses. And sometimes it just gets tweaked. It may change a lot. We'll talk about Darwin. Darwin's a really big deal in terms of basic starting ideas of evolution, but they were the basic starting ideas. Is that a lot of those ideas have fallen out of favor? Is that because evidence kind of refutes them? And a lot of them have been expanded on and tweaked and changed in major ways. But that's how science works. And the fact that we'll tell you something, and then later we'll go, maybe not. I mean, that's what's happening right now with the virus stuff, where they run a tiny little test and get results. We'll talk about why tiny tests are not reliable. And then somebody expands the test and the results just kind of dissipate. They just kind of disappear. And the last thing on this list of rules, very, very important part of science is peer review. And if you can't read it, it says, that's it? That's peer review? I'm putting a big X through my stuff. It's a specialized pursuit, science. And you're going to do stuff and produce stuff, and who gets to judge it? Who gets to decide whether your hypothesis has merit, or your test is set up well, or your results mean what you think your results mean? I can't tell you how many times I've looked through a study, and then I get to the, and having worked through the results and stuff, I go, okay, I think I see what's going on here. And then I get to the conclusions, and it's like, what? Really? And it's doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong and I'm right. It's just we're funneling it through two different brains and seeing two different things. But the thing is, I've got the background to be able to work through their stuff and hopefully have the basis to judge it. Sometimes I find out I didn't know enough, and I'm absolutely wrong because I made it was bringing in misinformation or incomplete information. But the idea of somebody who knows how your system works looking over your stuff. In the real world, in like pharmaceuticals, you're sitting at a desk, there's a guy sitting at the next desk who you can bounce ideas off of, What about this compound? Oh no, we tried that 8 years ago. Is it, look it up on the computer? Is it okay, what if can we use these capsules? No, those will dissolve too early in the digestive system. You need something that's gonna get farther in and release more slowly. Is it peers bring their experience to bear on all aspects? And in the commercial world, usually you're working with other people in your field, so every single step of the way, you've got somebody looking over your stuff. In what's called the academic world, research done at universities, a lot of basic research is done at universities. Then you may have a supervisor. Supervisor himself doesn't really have any peers except the people working in his lab who aren't really as trained as well as he is. And what often happens in academic research is you do your stuff, you do your research, you get it all wrapped up, you write it up in a very neat little package with all of the references and stuff, and you send it off to a journal to be published. And the journal editor looks at it and glances through it and goes, who have I got that knows this stuff? Because he's not your peer, he doesn't work in your field, but he has access to people. And he sends it out to reviewers. Your paper goes out to reviewers. And in academic research, that's often the major peer review, where you've done everything, and now somebody's going to judge whether it's worth actually publishing or not. And they may come back with questions. I know when I did mine, is that somebody came back and said, I think we need to drop this whole procedures section because everybody knows how to do that. And I was able to, it's anonymous, so you just send it into the editor. But I was able to go, I tried to look this up. You probably learned it from somebody in your lab because it isn't written down anywhere. I thought it was valuable to actually have it in the paper. And he or she must have decided that was true because it wound up being in the final published version of the paper. But sometimes it comes back and it goes, nah, this isn't really. And the journal goes, we're not publishing it. It's not unique enough, or it's too flawed, or is it, you'll hear about papers getting through the peer review process who really never should have gotten through the peer review process because there's a lot of problems with them. This is supposed to put just the best stuff forward, but that's the way that science works. Now from here, we're going to go into the nuts and bolts stuff, what's called scientific method, and that'll be in the next one.